This conference will now be recorded.
I do not see Tino's name here.
Maybe wait just a minute or two, see if he pops in.
But I have been following it. I have been looking at the data and trying to understand it myself. And I've been talking to Ed Torres at Altamont Springs about it and what they're seeing.
Yeah, it sounded like they were using it to sort of continue to justify some of the ordinances that they had in place. In Pinellas County.
Yeah, they've got that whole Ultra Pure thing. I apologize.
Looks like we're up to 47. So, Jeff, I'm ready whenever you are. If you still want to wait for Santino to join, I'm okay with that too.
I think he's on a call right now. Jeff is.
Oh. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm going to start in just a couple of minutes, but I hope everyone is remaining healthy and well as of late. So Jeff, I'm ready whenever you are. If you want to wait for Santino, that's your prerogative, but I think we could start whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone and Happy New Year, as Ed indicated. We appreciate everybody's attendance. We don't have a super long agenda today, but we have some things that I think are going to start laying the foundation for some things that we may be having to deal with in the not too distant future. I'm sure Tino will join us in a minute. I'm Jeff Greenwell with Hillsborough County. Are we going to go around, Maya? Or are you going to just cover that, or how are we going to do that? I forgot what we did. Otherwise, I'll just turn it over to Ed to talk about the 2020 water quality and the RA update and what everybody's been waiting for, which of course is Old Tampa Bay.
How about we do read off folks' names so that we get an understanding who's attending and what entity they're representing.
Absolutely. Maya, I'll leave that to you.
Sure. I'm Maya Burke. I'm the Assistant Director of the Estuary Program. Marcus.
Hi, I'm Marcus. I'm the Program Scientist for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
Alicia.
Alicia Osmus, Busch Gardens, Tampa.
Amy.
Amy Butler, Tampa Electric Company.
Tom Ash.
Tom Ash, Environmental Protection Commission.
Ashley.
Ashley Painter, City of Oldsmar.
Al.
Al Braithwaite, City Manager, Oldsmar.
Brendan.
Hey, Brendan Myers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based at McDill.
Carlos.
Carlos Fry, City of St. Petersburg's Engineering Department.
Chris Pratt.
Chris Pratt, Environmental Protection Commission.
David Glicksberg.
David Glicksberg with Hillsborough County.
David Porter.
Dave Porter, City of Clearwater Public Utilities Director.
I don't know who this one is.
I think that's Irv Keaty.
Okay. We'll go to, is Irv there? We'll go to Heather Maggio.
Hello, Heather Maggio, City of Tampa.
Ilya.
Good morning, Ilya. Welcome, Duke Energy.
Jan.
That might be in Bennett, City of Oldsmar.
Jan
Yeah.
McLean, City of Tampa.
Okay, and then did we do Nan Bennett? Did that?
Yes.
Okay, and Jeff Barath,
HRK, former Piney Point.
and
Buffett.
you guys know Jeff Greenwell, Jeff Hilton, John Walkinshaw,
John Walkinshaw, Freeman Peterson.
Josh Neese,
Josh Neese, Pristine Aqua Farm.
Juanita,
Pasco County Public Works.
Julie,
Good morning, Julie Espy, Florida DEP Division of Environmental Assessment and Restoration Director.
Lisa,
Hi, Lisa Ray, City of St. Petersburg, Water Resources Department.
Lizanne,
Lizanne Garcia, Southwest Florida Water Management District, swim section.
can you hear better now, Lizanne?
It's still not as good as it was when there were fewer people online. I'm not sure what the change is, so I'll just listen carefully.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Melanie,
Melanie Grulone, Tampa Bay Watch.
Michael,
Mike Perry, City of St. Pete Engineering.
Michelle Duggan,
Good morning, Michelle Duggan, Pinellas County Utilities.
Michelle Holton,
Michelle Holton, Hillsborough County.
Nancy Norton,
Good morning. This is Nancy from Swift Mud Swim Program.
Pete Owens,
Morning, Pete Owens with Applied Sciences.
and Ray,
Ray Pribble, Janicki Environmental.
Renee Cooper,
Renee Cooper, City of Safety Harbor.
Richard Powell, Rob Brown,
Rob Brown, Manatee County.
Ryan Riordan,
Ryan Reardon, Hillsborough County.
Sarah Kessler,
Sarah Kessler, City of Clearwater in the Engineering Department.
Scott Browning,
Scott Browning, Manatee County.
Sean McGinnis,
Hi, Sean McGinnis, Lakeland Electric.
Shelby,
Shelby Boschman, City of Largo Environmental Services.
Simon, Stacy Day,
Hey, Stacy Day, Pinellas County Environmental Management.
Suganda,
Sugandha Shankar, Fish and Wildlife Research Institute.
Tim Bassett,
Good morning, Tim Bassett, City of Largo, wastewater manager.
Tony,
Tony Janicki Environmental.
Vivian,
Vivian Glebe, City of Largo, Environmental Services.
and Winston.
Winston Borkowski, Hopping Green Sam's here for Tropicana.
And I think that there were a few people that might have come in while I was making my way through the list. If anybody wants to introduce themselves that hasn't had a chance.
Hi, this is Susan Hockley with the City of Bradenton.
Hi, Susan.
All right, well, welcome everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Ed to do the 2020 water quality and NMCRA update.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm gonna share my screen now. Y'all see the presentation now?
Yes.
Well, thank you for everyone attending this morning. Like I said at the beginning, Happy New Year. I hope everyone's remaining healthy and well as of late. I think what we try to do at the beginning of each year for the consortium is do a year in review, as well as outline sort of the activities that we see are necessary for the consortium to undertake over the course of the next year. So that's going to be sort of the overview of this presentation, but I think the main thing we also want some from input and feedback on the consortium on is the reporting that we'll have to do, our annual assessment through the reasonable assurance updates that we have committed to doing. We want some feedback on how to proceed for this past year, and I'll get into sort of the details on that as I move through the presentation. But I also want to set the stage again, because we do have a lot of turnover and some newer folks entering into the consortium, to give this 10,000-foot view of our activities. Believe it or not, we're actually in our 30th year as a program. We're going to be celebrating our 30th anniversary in 2021. And if you look way back at the beginning of the program, you know, that has really set the stage and the path that we're proceeding on now, both through the estuary programs management conferences and partners, as well as through this nitrogen management consortium. Much of our work was focused on trying to restore seagrasses to those 1950s levels, and the nitrogen management consortium has been very instrumental in terms of helping us achieve those goals over the past 30 years. So even at the start of our program, it was recognized that we needed this public-private collaboration to help us achieve that goal of restoring seagrasses. And you know, our premise has always been focused on trying to reduce nitrogen loads to Tampa Bay so that we could reduce the amount of algae in the bay, clear up the water quality so that light can penetrate and seagrasses can grow and recover. A lot of the early work that we did through both the estuary program and the initial starts of the consortium was on a voluntary basis. We developed voluntary nutrient management targets through the estuary program. And about 1998, those voluntary targets were formally developed into a federal TMDL. Not long after that, the state actually passed some legislation to come up with alternative strategies to address potential TMDLs that were being promulgated along that time. So about 2001, the allowance for a reasonable assurance determination by the state was formally adopted through the Florida Watershed Restoration Act and the Impaired Waters rules that were promulgated along those times. The consortium in 2002 capitalized on that. We developed our first reasonable assurance update back in 2002, according to those new state statutes, and that put us on a path of trying to, again, come up with this voluntary nutrient management strategy for the benefit of restoring seagrasses in Tampa Bay. During that time, that initial reasonable assurance determination, another important thing that happened was that the state formally recognized the chlorophyll A thresholds that were developed by the estuary program as regulatory thresholds to help guide future assessments and understand progress of meeting water quality goals for the benefit of seagrasses. So that was an important sort of time step for the consortium, because those are now sort of the regulatory guidelines we use to annually assess water quality according to this nutrient management strategy that was developed collaboratively with both the estuary program and the nitrogen management consortium. Things changed once again around the time of 2007 because there was a federally promulgated TMDL back in 1998, and we had a state determination of reasonable assurance. DEP and EPA basically required that we start to develop allocations so that we were consistent with the federally adopted TMDL. During the course of that 2007 RA update, some of you probably remember the lengthy meetings we had over that time through about 2009 and 2010 to come up with allocations that would be commensurate with that federal TMDL, as well as achieve the goals of continued seagrass recovery in Tampa Bay, as well as to take into consideration the needs of each of the NMC partners represented on this call today. So that was very much a collaborative process of developing about 181 discrete allocations to entities and sources within the major bay segments leading to Tampa Bay. And those recommended allocations in the 2009 RA addendum were then formally adopted through the DEP's QBEL and a final order process in 2010. So those are basically what you guys now know as your permit conditions based on allocations that were developed back in that 2009 document. In subsequent updates, and I should mention it's not on the timeline that I'm showing here, but in 2011, the state also went through a process of defining estuarine numeric nutrient criteria, and many of the loading targets that were developed through the consortium were later adopted as Tampa Bay estuarine nutrient numeric nutrient criteria. So the numeric nutrient criteria adopted for Tampa Bay relate to a total amount of load per unit water per hydrologic load to the bay segment in Tampa Bay, and that has now been formally recognized as the estuarine numeric nutrient criteria. So that's another sort of important time step and benchmark to keep in the back of your minds as well. Subsequent to all that activity, we've done 2 more reasonable assurance updates in 2012. That was the first one after we formally adopted allocations for each of the entities, and for the most part, much of the work after the initial allocation development and development of numeric nutrient criteria were just to formalize and refine some of the interim allocations that were defined in that 2009 document. And moving on to 2017, we've actually saw some significant progress in the bay in terms of overall seagrass recovery, and during that 2017 reasonable assurance update, we actually met our seagrass recovery goal for Tampa Bay. About 25 years in the making at that time, but we were all celebrating the success of our collective efforts in helping to meet that accomplishment during that time period. And as we move into the next reasonable assurance update in 2022, we're now on the fourth. We now surpassed the fourth year of the 5-year process. We're continuing our work to assess the conditions in the bay and adjust our management accordingly based on the response. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about now is sort of the results that we've been seeing over this last 5-year period. So again, just trying to set the stage and sort of the overall context and history of the activities in the consortium and some of the key time periods and decisions and actions that were undertaken over the history of the consortium. This presentation is actually linked in the agenda, and all those colored text that you see on the screen are active links to some of the documents that are sort of the governing documents that we're providing guidance to the consortium activities as well as the estuary program. So it's a good reference slide if you ever need to look back at when I refer to certain documents that sort of are guiding the activities. So one of the biggest things that we do through the consortium is do this annual reasonable assurance assessment, and this is basically outlined in section 8 of that 2009 reasonable assurance addendum, and basically outlines the activities that the consortium would pursue and report to both DEP and EPA on water quality conditions supportive of our overall nutrient management strategy for the bay. The assessment is predicated on assessing chlorophyll A conditions in each of the bay segments relative to those regulatory thresholds. And when we don't meet those chlorophyll A regulatory thresholds, then there's additional assessment steps that the consortium has committed to in those past documents. And it's anywhere looking at sort of the bay segment total loadings as a whole, or potentially looking at individual source allocations if we don't meet certain conditions. And basically the possible outcomes if we're not meeting chlorophyll A conditions for 2 straight years is a potential adjustment of that overall bay segment total nitrogen TMDL, and or are looking at more refinements to the source load allocations represented in a particular bay segment. So again, for reference, that first bullet point is an active link to those assessment steps. This is very much a broad overview of that, and there's some additional details, but our annual assessment predicates an initial report that we delivered to DEP and EPA. That's what I'll be talking about for the remainder of this presentation. I'll pause right there. I heard some audio. I didn't know if anyone had a question. If not, I'll keep on pushing ahead. So about this time last year, we were at the point where, you know, we've been seeing these periodic exceedances in the Old Tampa Bay segment, and 2019's data indicated that we did not meet that regulatory threshold. And at this point last year, we were very much at the point of you know, considering what circumstances might need to be taken by the consortium if we did not meet that regulatory threshold again in 2020 for the Old Tampa Bay segment. So at the start of this past year, you know, our focus was on some of the broader nitrogen management consortium topics that still remained with you know, future reasonable assurance updates, and those topics are still something that probably needs to be addressed through the 2020 RA update. I'm referring to some of the initial discussions about possible land use, land cover changes that have occurred since we developed the allocations back in 2009, and some of the refinements that might be necessary based on those changes to land use, land cover changes, as well as jurisdictional boundary changes that might have occurred since the original passing of those allocations. We also started looking at sort of the future loadings that were developed in the past and how they compare to what we're observing now. And as I mentioned, you know, we did formally develop and submit a 2019 reasonable assurance assessment to DEP around, I think, the April timeframe last year. Intermixed in those conversations were this need to, you know, reinvigorate some discussions in the Old Tampa Bay segment, because we know we were seeing intermittent exceedances of that regulatory threshold, and there's some trepidation if we did not meet it again in 2020. So we had several good discussions with a working group to hone in on the data and make sure we're making logical connections with the chlorophyll A conditions that are being observed in Old Tampa Bay and how they might affect the light environment, as well as seagrass resources in that segment. So those discussions culminated, I think, around November last year, where we did have some preliminary data up until that point from EPC that indicated we were heading the direction of not meeting the chlorophyll A regulatory threshold based on the existing data that was being collected at that time. So we entered the holidays in this precarious position of potentially not meeting that threshold, and that's basically what I'm updating you all today. We have since acquired all data that's been collected by EPC in each of the bay segments that we used for these annual assessments from the Consortium and the estuary program. And the data we have at hand is still considered provisional, and also, as was discussed during the course of last year, you recognize with the pandemic there is some data gaps actually in the record from 2020. All that being said, the data we have in hand for each of the bay segments indicates that Old Tampa Bay exceeded the regulatory threshold. Had we had data for April, May, there's a potential likelihood that we would have been below the regulatory threshold. But the data we have at hand as it stands right now indicates that we're above that regulatory threshold for 2 straight years. And this is sort of the position that we're not looking fondly on towards the tail end of last year, but we have been preparing for quite some time because of the observed conditions that we've seen in Old Tampa Bay. We know that Old Tampa Bay has struggled with certain issues, namely some pyridinium blooms that have been occurring there every summer since about 2008-9 time period. So we know we have these lingering questions on how best to manage that bay segment, and how we now move forward through the consortium's process to handle that. That's sort of the main topic of discussions that we're bringing to this body today. You know, the assessment steps that I talked about earlier are fairly straightforward of what actions we should take. The really sort of uncertainty we have now is because of the data gaps represented in the record from 2020, is whether or not, you know, these additional NMC actions are warranted, and that's where we want sort of your feedback. Traditionally, if we didn't have these data gaps, we would be proceeding to NMC action, formally proceeding through to NMC action 3, which is taking a look at the total loadings to the Old Tampa Bay segment relative to the federally recognized TMDL. The data we've been acquiring over the past several years on an annual basis. So we now have estimates of total nitrogen loads from 2017, 18, and 19 that have been assembled by Tony's shop, and Ray's going to discuss some of that data, I think, a little bit later. But you know, that data that we collected seems to indicate that we're below the federally recognized TMDL. So if we were to proceed all the way down to that action, and with a collection of new data in 2020, if that was still the case, that you know we're still below the federally recognized TMDL, but we seem to be exceeding the chlorophyll A regulatory threshold. So the steps that we outline is assessing sort of the base segment of similar capacity. The big question, and we've had these questions with the consortium co-chairs in light of sort of the provisional data and the data gaps that we have for 2020, is do we necessarily need to go down that full path in this initial report that we deliver to DEP? We did, as an SU program staff and with Tony Shop's help, look at potential other ways to fill in those data gaps for 2020. So you looked at some of the University of South Florida work to use remote sensing to fill in those data gaps with remote sense data for that period. We did look at Pinellas County data as well to potentially fill in those data gaps for the April-May time period. But our initial looks, and again, this was briefly done over the holidays, seem to indicate that there wasn't very, very strong correlations with the existing EPC data set for those other ancillary data sources. So we have attempted to look at sort of what were the potential conditions in April-May, and whether or not we could use those surrogate data sources to make some inferences on an overall estimate if we were to fill in those gaps. But some of our initial efforts didn't prove successful. And like I said, some of the correlations were not very satisfying in our initial assessments. So I'll leave it at that for now. But I think the main thing that we're focused on, at least initially in 2021, is developing that initial report on the water quality conditions and the seagrass conditions in all the bay segments, in particular responding to the chlorophyll A conditions in Old Tampa Bay, at least over the past 2 years, where we did have some higher chlorophyll A conditions. We do think it's important to continue to assemble the loading information from all entities so that we get ahead of the game and have an understanding of what the loading conditions were for both 2020 and prior, so that we could do a better job of making the assessment of where we're at in terms of our overall nitrogen management strategy. And I think our goal again is to prepare a report to present back to the consortium in the April timeframe based on assembling of that initial data. And with the goal of delivering that initial report to DEP around the April-May timeframe. Again, I think the question is, what is the degree of comfort of the consortium on sort of the additional assessment steps I outlined and the necessity to perhaps pursue those in 2021. I think from the estuary program's overall management standpoint, we were going to continue down the path of trying to investigate ways to help Old Tampa Bay segment meet that chlorophyll regulatory threshold as well as management targets we've defined. We have partnered with FWRI actually on a grant proposal back in December that might bring in some additional resources towards the tail end of this year to come up with a research agenda and plan to further investigate, why Old Tampa Bay is responding much differently to our management paradigms relative to the other bay segments, and again look at and investigate other options, that go above and beyond potentially nutrient load management, but also look at sort of the other contributing factors and stressors that might be eliciting this chlorophyll response in Old Tampa Bay. So the graph on the right are basically the data we have in hand. The red dots are the actual data we have in hand for Old Tampa Bay in 2020, and the box plots are just showing the spread of data for each of those months over the historic period. This is EPC data going back to the mid-1970s up until the current. So we did have some higher than normal chlorophyll conditions in June and July again, and again that has been primarily attributed to a pyridinium bloom. I think what pushed us over the edge, even with the data gap, was a fairly high November value relative to meeting conditions that have been observed in the past. But as I mentioned, if we did have data, and do you guys see my pointer? Let me do it now.
Yes.
So if we did have data for these months, it's like I said, it's likely that we would have been below this threshold. But using the data at hand, we are where we are at this point, and I think we'll pursue reporting the data accordingly. It's really a matter of consortium discussion on, how far down that assessment pathway you want to go, and potentially put into a reasonable assessment report that we deliver both initially in April and then potentially anything that would follow up later in the year. So I think my next slide is basically getting at some of these questions and opening it up to the floor for that feedback. And after putting sort of this year in context, I think there's been some discussion because of those data gaps of whether or not Old Tampa Bay's 2020 chlorophyll estimate would be considered an anomalous event that we would just report on in this initial report to DEP. And then again, if we went down that path, it's much different than sort of reporting on sort of the other assessment actions that are further outlined in the overall assessment framework that is in the reasonable assurance documents.
You have a question in the chat about just causes for the elevated November values.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that for November. I think we've developed some updated data assessment tools, and I don't think there was any lingering pyridinium in Old Tampa Bay in November that was driving that high chlorophyll A value. But that's something we could explore further as the data comes in and are finalized. My recollection is that most of the summertime bloom of pyridinium was dissipated by that November timeframe, and I'm at a loss why we had a higher than normal value in November without digging into the data more.
Right, not correlation's not necessarily causation, but I do think we had a pretty wet November, if I remember right. So
yeah, Tropical Storm Ada maybe too.
Not to try to predispose what the answer might be, but if we were to look into that, Nan, that'd be the first place I'd start.
Yeah, and there's some other things after we get through this discussion. I mean, there's some external drivers that might be influencing some of the observed chlorophyll conditions we're seeing as of late. There's some indication that there's been changing hydrology in the Bay segment, and it overall, I think the past 5 to 7 years has been a wetter period in the region. So there is more hydrologic load potentially going into the old Tampa Bay segment than has historically been the case, and whether or not that's driving some of the chlorophyll response in that Bay segment, there's still a lot of data crunching we need to do, but that's part of sort of the assessment steps and our fine look at the data that we've been trying to get ahead of. In a lot of the work we did through the Tampa Bay Working Group and with the Consortium, and that will continue, through the better part of this year as well.
So Ed, we have another question. How does TN look?
TN loads or concentrations in the Bay?
Stacy, do you want to clarify your question? Concentrations.
We haven't looked at the concentration values, but for the most part, my recollection from past just data assessments, there hasn't been anything that causes me concerns in terms of TN concentration, observed TN concentrations in the Bay segments proper. If anything, they've reduced since the 1990s, and they've been pretty much bouncing around sort of levels that don't cause me concern, but that's something that we would have to take a look at. The nitrogen load delivery ratio that is now the numeric nutrient criteria for the each of the Bay segments is in a ways a nutrient concentration. It's a tons of nitrogen per million cubic meters of water, and that equates somewhat to a concentration. And those values has been steadily decreasing through time. The issue at hand is that, with that, observed condition, we're still showing high chlorophyll A values in that Bay segment. And the next step, at least from the estuary program's perspective, is understanding if those chlorophyll A conditions are having an impact on seagrass resources that are different than sort of the paradigm that we've been operating all the way back to the start of our history.
Dave Porter also has a question about indications from FDEP about how the missing data might influence compliance status.
Yeah, I've talked with Julie, and I know Julie SB is on the line now. I also know that the department has some guidance moving into this past year in light of the pandemic and sort of the regulatory discretion they might have in light of data gaps that have been experienced because of the pandemic. I won't speak for her, but if Julie, if you want to unmute yourself and kind of give your perspectives on what I outlined and Dave's question, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure, be happy to. Appreciate the opportunity to hear all this and talk with you, Ed, earlier, I guess last week. While I think we're all, there are going to be lots of things this year that have asterisks associated with them, and we recognize just the inability to go out and collect data at certain times this year. I know just at DEP, we've had lab limitations, field source resource limitations, and things like that. So I do think that, we recognize that as a potential reason why Old Tampa Bay is not passing this year. But we also know that Tampa Bay has been problematic throughout. And, we saw in your slide there that even in 2017 it was over, and then again in 2019. And I know you guys are continuing to look at that, and I think you should just pursue that. Keep looking at what's going on in that particular basin and why perhaps we're not meeting those targets consistently. Some of the recommendations that you had on your slide, I think those are really good ideas, just to keep looking at Old Tampa Bay. And I think someone else asked about the Courtney Campbell project, and I was curious, what is the status on that, because that was certainly something we saw as a good benefit, a project that could really help the flushing in Old Tampa Bay and perhaps help this issue.
Nan, can you confirm if you're talking about the circulation cut that was already installed on the east side of the causeway, or were you referring to the newer proposal to do a similar kind of effort on the west side of the Courtney Campbell?
So I guess what my advisement would be is that I think, you would probably be okay to say this is an anomalous event because you're missing data. But again, as I said, we know, that doesn't mean that we can just relax and, wait till next year, because Old Tampa Bay has certainly been problematic throughout. And so I would support, any of those recommendations that you guys are considering as far as delving into the details of Old Tampa Bay, looking at it more closely. I think that is certainly deserved.
Is anybody here from DOT that can speak to their overall program, and if anything is planned for the future with better circulation through the Courtney Campbell?
I will say that the project on the east side is complete and they're in the monitoring phase. I don't know if Sarah can talk to the stuff on the west side, or like you said, if someone from FDOT could, but I didn't see.
Yeah, the on the west side, we DOT is helping us with the permitting right now. So we're going through that, and we've applied for cooperative funding for next year. And so we're moving forward and hopefully have, excuse me, final design ready for construction in probably the summer of 2022 is what we're hoping.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, we discussed some of these potential solutions in altering some of the circulation for the benefit of water quality in Old Tampa Bay. I think all the way going back to 2019 through the Consortium. And the Consortium did develop a letter and submitted to DOT for them to consider similar sort of projects, not only on the Courtney Campbell, but along the Howard Franklin Bridge. Probably if you've driven over the Howard Franklin lately, they are doing some pile drive testing. They're actually closing the bridge, I think this weekend for additional work on the northbound or the North Bridge's replacement. And we were very active as an estuary program and the Consortium to get DOT to consider potential alterations to the Howard Franklin Bridge causeway that would coordinate and perhaps enhance water quality in and around that bridge span. To date, I don't think we've had any sort of positive feedback from DOT in terms of them pursuing a project on the Howard Franklin Bridge. But I think that is sort of a linchpin activity for some of the areas where we do see fairly significantly high chlorophyll A values in and around the Feather Sound region. And we know that through some past modeling efforts that, you know, there could be potential benefits if similar causeway breaches were pursued on the Howard Franklin Bridge causeway. We continue to pursue that conversation in the region, but again, so far unsuccessful in that effort. But I think, you know, renewed interest from the consortium, especially in light of these chlorophyll A conditions, might help DOT look at options for that could occur and that coincide with that bridge replacement that is now, I think, approaching $1 billion.
Yep. It's $1 billion, and what we were asking for was an increase in cost of about $30 million. It's not even in the, you know, it's lost in their overage probably. So we really don't understand why they wouldn't help with that, because there's really strong evidence that opening up that west side would dramatically help Old Tampa Bay.
So was there any more questions?
Yeah, there's one more question. So Lizanne is asking if there's an option to look at historical data for the data. She says June and July, but I think she means April and May, or May and June, to derive a surrogate value for those months.
Yeah, if we did attempt to do that in a fairly quick fashion over the holidays. Marcus did much of that work, but I think the data we have available to us, which is from two sources, there's satellite data from USF that we could use to fill in for those particular months. And then Pinellas County has continued some of their collections in the shallow water portions of Old Tampa Bay within the Pinellas County boundary. So when we looked at that data relative to the EPC data, the long-term EPC data, you know, there are, you know, we could combine those data sets and look at sort of correlations, but those correlations were not very satisfying, and I don't think they were fairly significant in terms of statistical robustness. Marcus, I don't know if you want to make any comment on sort of the initial observations. And again, this was a very initial look at making an effort to fill in those data gaps. There's potentially other ways to look at it. Marcus, you want to give your perspective?
Yeah, so essentially what we tried to do was look at these alternative data sets, as Ed was explaining. And it's tricky because there's, you know, not a strong precedent for this. You know, the two data sets that Ed mentioned were the remote sense data and the Pinellas County data. And, you know, challenges with any remote sensing data is it's just that, it's a surrogate, and correlations can break down for a number of reasons. You know, you're looking at different measurements in space and time, and it's very difficult to compare sort of apples to apples with, you know, an EPC data set with something that is essentially a measurement that's a surrogate taken from space. So it can be challenging. And then with the Pinellas County data, I mean, that's obviously a great resource for us, but it's different locations and different collection dates as well. So similar challenges there as comparing it with the remote sensing data. The correlations were a lot better with Pinellas County data, but it's not the same locations, and it's just a lot challenging for those reasons I just mentioned.
So Lizanne is specifically asking about like using a rolling average from the actual historic EPC data.
Yeah, so if we do that, if we use the previous 5 years data and fill in that May and April data gap, we will actually be below the regulatory threshold. We just don't have any precedence of doing an assessment in that fashion, and basically that's a decision on I think of the consortium. What I presented to you was the data we have collected, or EPC has collected, and that we've traditionally reported on for the given calendar year.
Ed, this is Tom Ash. I got a question, if I may.
Yeah.
And it's kind of for Julie, but I'll throw it out there for everyone. You know, Julie had mentioned that a lot of data is going to have an asterisk next to it this year. Do we have any sense of DEP's feeling on a statewide scale? I mean, there's TMDLs and BMAPs all over the state, obviously, and we can't be the only entity dealing with this issue. You know, I have to have some faith that someone in Tallahassee is thinking that we all get a do-over because of 2020. But I don't know if that conversation's even been had yet.
Well, that's not accurate, I guess. I mean, what I was saying is that just a lot of things in 2020, not data, because the data are what they are when they're collected. I mean, and that's the way our impaired waters assessment program and our TMDL evaluations, you know, we're looking at the data that are available at the time. For this particular assessment, it's critical that you guys have monthly data. That's the way the standard was established. You know, that's the way the loads are looked at. It's just, that's the way that particular assessment was set up. And so missing data for certain months can have an effect on your particular assessment. And that's why I think, you know, for this particular purpose, it is kind of, you know, anomalous because you're missing data. Now, that's not an excuse, you know, per se, but that is the way the assessment was set up in the standards. So I think it does kind of, you know, you're like, well, is it really a true assessment, right? Because you don't have all of the information that you typically would have. I think it's really important, I think, to Ed's point, that you have all that historical data. And so you can make that argument that, well, if we'd had those months, we likely would be under the criteria, you know, which is great. But it's just that it's missing this year. That's why I think it does kind of fall under that anomalous event, you know, action, I guess. I mean,
yeah, and I understand. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yep, go ahead. I was done.
I understand that. I guess what I'm suggesting is that are we the only entity in the state of Florida that has this issue? Were there other programs? I think I heard you say even DEP itself had issues with field monitoring, laboratory analyses, lack of staffing in order to do some of those things. Are we the only entity that you know of that's in this predicament?
Yes, at this time. So the way the rest of our criteria are set up, you know, our numeric nutrient criteria and our other standards, we have 2 seasonal periods. So we have a much easier time of collecting the sufficient data within those periods to calculate our annual geometric means. We only have to have 4 samples for the year. So if we missed April and May, but we were out there, you know, in March and June, it doesn't affect some of the other things that, you know, we're doing at the department. So, yeah.
So Julie, I'm sorry, Tom, if you've got something else, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm good, Jeff. I'm wrestling internally with an average is an average, whether you collect 5 times a year, or 4 times a year, or 12 times a year. But I think Julie answered my question.
Okay. So Julie, I think without putting words in your mouth, it sounds like through the framework, we never actually get past action 2, NMC action 2, which we basically say because it's an anomalous event, we're not going to report on this year. So if that were the case and DEP could support that, what happens to this year? We just consider next year the 2 sequential years?
I think that's what I would do. Yeah, that's what I would be looking at.
And we wouldn't report for any bay segment because the anomalous event is not unique to Old Tampa Bay, we weren't able to collect these samples in any of the 4 bay segments.
Right. I mean, I think you should still report on them. As I said, I mean, that's, you know, it's good information you got, and it wasn't, you know, 10 or something like that micrograms per liter. So I think all of that supporting information showing that what the levels are in all the base segments, even though you're missing, showing the historical data for April and May and what the levels typically are, all of that information supports, I think, our ability to say, yes, we think, you know, this is probably a year when we had insufficient data, you know, due to a pandemic. And so let's, you know, look at Old Tampa Bay again next year, and you know, see how things look. But again, I don't mean that we should just sit back and, you know, wait and see. But that would be my recommendation.
Right, and it certainly wasn't suggesting that, and wasn't suggesting we wouldn't report it, just that it wouldn't bring us into the framework past action item number 2. And then how do we then address moving forward with 2021? If we had a non-compliance event in 2021, we would just consider that the second sequential year.
Yes.
Try to understand that as well, and then that would kick us into potentially getting farther down into that framework.
Yeah. And that's my recommendation. I'm not putting words into the consortium's mouth. I mean, certainly you guys can, if you think you want to go to action step 3, you know, that's totally up to you.
But based on what you've seen so far, you think that is something the department could support?
Yes.
Okay. Because I mean, honestly, I used to sit on your side of the table, and it could have cut the other way as well. I mean, these are 2 of our more favorable months that we missed, but it certainly could have been August and July or August and September, which would have potentially been in our favor or in the Bay's favor. And while I clearly recognize Old Tampa Bay is problematic for whatever reason, my personal opinion is the hydraulic limitation flushing. I'll get my plug DOT. I'd hate to have to go there on a year when we didn't have all the data, and particularly data that might have allowed us to muddle through past the 9.3.
Well,
So.
a good example, Jeff, you know, you had mentioned, and we talked about that high number in November. If we had been missing data in November and plugged in historical numbers, we would have appreciably reduced the annual mean by doing that data, insertion of historical data. So it's really a slippery slope.
So
Yeah.
to that point, there is another question in the chat about whether or not we ought to consider going ahead and making a change in our process that allows us to use historical data when there are data gaps. It could happen again, and it would be good to have addressed it in the process. Do you guys want to weigh in on that? Respond.
Yeah, I think that the way we've traditionally handled sort of those decision points would be to develop a decision memo outlining any updates to the assessment framework that we think are necessary for this regional assurance period, and submit to DEP and EPA for their potential concurrence with those adjustments to the assessment framework. And that's certainly something we could look at if deemed warranted by the consortium. And that could be part of this initial report that we deliver for this year. That answer that question, or help answer that question?
Yes, it did. Thanks.
So getting back to this slide, you know, I'm hearing somewhat of consensus that, you know, for this initial report, you know, we report on the conditions of the bay, the data that we have in hand. We also explore these options to look at how we would potentially fill in data gaps in the future in an updated assessment framework, and provide that as a potential report to fulfill the consortium's requirements under the RA assessment framework for this particular year. I think beyond that, as I mentioned, I think the estuary program and all the partners involved, I think, are still committed to understanding what's going on in Old Tampa Bay, and we're continue to head down that path of how we best manage that bay segment. And I think those will again be topics of discussions and working group meetings of the Old Tampa Bay working group through the consortium through the course of 2021. And I think that's wise of the consortium again, so that we're potentially ahead of any of these questions if 2021 doesn't turn out as well as we're hoping it will. Again, I think it's always been the true value and gem of the consortium to get ahead of these things and do the work up front so that we're proactive and get the bay back on track. And that's what we're all here and focused on. So I don't think we need to hold any polls, but that's, I think, what I'm hearing in terms of consensus of the consortium for this initial work in 2021. If I'm misrepresenting what I'm hearing, please speak up now.
Ed, have we looked at the seagrasses? The chlorophyll A is an interim, indicator. How are the seagrasses looking? Do we think there's a downturn in Old Tampa Bay, proportionate to the higher chlorophyll A?
Yeah, so in 2020, the district will have an estimate of coverage, and this was the estimate they'll have would be before these observed chlorophyll A conditions. So we will have an updated estimate of seagrass coverage for the entirety of Tampa Bay for 2020, and we're hoping to get that by March, the latest of this year. And that will give us an indication of whether or not we're seeing slight declines in seagrass that have been observed from the 2016 and 2018 period on a baywide basis, and in particular in Old Tampa Bay. We also...
I was going to share, Ed, we've been looking at this up and down the whole West Coast, and just want to warn everybody that there's been an appreciable decline in seagrasses, basically up and down the Southwest Florida coast.
Yeah, so we're expecting the 2020 data to show slight declines in Old Tampa Bay and perhaps baywide, and I think the larger regional patterns that Tony was talking about, I think, have something to do with the region in its entirety showing higher hydrologic loads into the coastal areas over this time period. Other thing I do want to mention, we've been developing internally some updated information on the Seagrass Transects that are conducted annually by partners of the estuary program. And we do have annual Seagrass Transect information that's now in a data dashboard that Marcus put together. And in that data, from 2019 to 2020, we do see potential declines in coverage estimates in some of the transects in Old Tampa Bay. So the seagrass data information also gives us a cautionary response because we are seeing some patterns of loss, both from these sort of like 10,000 foot views of the district derived coverage estimates, and then at these finer scales too is some of the Seagrass Transect information. So it is not, it's probably not going to be a helpful data set in arguments of not doing anything in Old Tampa Bay. It's probably going to necessitate us to continue down this path of doing more.
Yeah, and I just one point of clarification. You mentioned the district's coverage maps. When those are released potentially in March, they would be reflective of changes from the 2016 data layer. I'm sorry, the 2018 data layer. So that 2-year period. So they would reflect not only what we've seen in Tampa Bay in 2020, but also the 2019 period as well.
Yeah, but that 2020 data set would be before the chlorophyll A conditions that we're reporting on in this assessment.
Correct.
The aerials were flown in late December 2019 and early 2020.
Okay.
Ed, Tony's got a question about whether or not EPA has provided any direction with regard to the data gaps.
No, I need to reach out to them directly. Normally they've been fairly hands-off, and we've relied on sort of the state guidance because this is a regional assurance process that is governed under state statute. So that is something we could do between now and the next consortium meeting, reach out to EPA and get their feel and guidance on this. Tony, did that address your thoughts, or do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just like, like Tom brought up with Julie, that, the state has this problem to be able to wrangle with, and I'm sure it's not just Florida that has a problem with this. So it would be interesting to see if anybody would provide some specific regulatory guidance with regard to that. When we wrote this thing, the framework, the decision framework, when we talked about anomalous events, we were talking about things like hurricanes, which are rare. There's not much you can do a lot about them, well, unless you want to work with climate change. But that, that's kind of, I think everyone would agree that that's what we had in the back of our minds when we were talking about anomalous events. But this one was, it just wasn't reasonable to be able to get that information during that time period. Kudos to EPC and everybody else out there doing this work that they've been able to deal with since that time period.
Yeah, I think the getting back on the track in terms of developing a decision memo that would outline how we would handle these data gaps in the future in our assessment framework, and then asking for both EPA and DEP concurrence on that is probably a valuable next step that we should pursue, and probably should be a part of the report that we deliver later on in April-May time period of this year.
Yeah, and I'd suggest that in that we report on all the dead ends that we looked at, because there's going to be a lot of ways of skinning this cat, it looks like, but that cat can really struggle if we skin too deeply.
Yeah, using the previous 5-year average seemed to be the most palatable in terms of potentially filling in that data gap, but there's additional assessments that we need to do with all the data sources we have available to us, and I think that's work we could pursue over the course of the next couple of months and report back to the consortium on.
Ed, we have another question in the chat. Were there any observed effects to the bay segments, particularly Old Tampa Bay, from I think Carlos is referring to Hurricane Irma, when all the water was sucked out of the bay?
I think between the October and November time period is when I think we got some hurricane-induced rainfall, and that might have been a driver of the November event. But prior to that, I can't. I have to look at the timing and when the data was actually collected.
I think he's talking about back in 2017, if that drove any seagrass loss, and I don't think we know until we get the new maps, maybe. Or Carlos, do you want to clarify your question, because we're not sure what you're asking?
Yeah, just simply that if there's any chance of being able to tie any of the effects we may see to any of the, as Ian indicated, the hurricane events, and we know when the water was sucked out, did it have a long-term effect that we might be able to pick up on, just as another occurrence that affected the bay itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually the three Southwest Florida National Ocean Programs developed a paper. Dave Tomasca was the lead on that, talking about some of the hurricane-induced impacts to seagrass resources in Southwest Florida that we didn't experience as significant of impacts as some of the other estuary programs south of us, but we did see those declines in coverage from 2016 to 2018, and whether or not they persist with the new 2020 data set. I think that's the needed data we need to sort of make those additional inferences and assessments on long-term impacts. The overall, again, the additional data we have available to us, looking at the Seagrass Transect data, which is a very different data set from the district's aerial coverage estimates. We have generally seen increasing seagrass coverage and more dense seagrass coverage through time and throughout Tampa Bay. There's been this sort of acute decline towards the tail end of our data collection efforts, and I'm showing it here on the right in this slide. So there are some indications from some of the monitoring data we have that seagrasses are responding to something, whether or not it's the chlorophyll A conditions or these higher hydrologic events or past hurricanes. That's something, again, we need to take a better look at. But given the available data resources, I don't know if we're going to be able to make those one-to-one links with any one perturbation. And it's just the difficulty of estuarine ecology. That probably did not address your question, Carlos, but
just something else to throw in the picture as we bring all the facts together. That's all. So I think you did a good job. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure that there isn't objection of heading down this path that we're discussing in terms of reporting on the data for 2020 and kind of explaining that the data gaps has prevented sort of an anomalous condition for reporting this year. But at the same time, as a consortium, we're committing to continuing down and exploring, what's going on in Old Tampa Bay. But the full-blown assessments that are discussed in the Reasonable Assurance Assessment Framework are not necessarily something that we need to report on later on in 2021, but we need to be prepping for that potentially going into next year. Does that sound palatable to the group? Is there objections to that path forward?
You can just let us know yes, or you want to talk more in the chat.
Do we need to put a motion on the floor if we're going to follow that path?
I would make that a motion. That's Tom Ash. I make the motion of what Ed just said. Don't ask me to repeat it.
Don't ask me to repeat it either.
Maya, did you get all that?
Yeah, it's recorded. We're good.
Okay, do we have a second on Ed's motion brought to the floor by Tom? As recorded by Maya?
Second.
So Lizanne's asking to repeat the path forward. So the path forward is that in the compliance assessment, we will provide the information as we were able to collect the data with the data gaps. We state that it is an anomalous event and we cannot make that compliance determination because those gaps are missing. We will give a thorough accounting of the paths that we use to try and fill those data gaps and why it is or is not appropriate. And then we will, for the regulatory purposes, we will stop there at action 2. But as a group, we are committed to not a full-blown assessment, but continued analyses and work to address the ongoing challenges in Old Tampa Bay segment.
So
And Jeff, as a point of order, the easiest way, what we do at the management board is just ask, are there any objections, rather than.
I was going to say, is there any further discussion first? Anybody else want to ask a question of the group or pose a scenario? So following Tom, I think that was you, Tom, suggestion, are there any objections to the motion on the floor? Assuming there are none, I'm going to go with it passed with unanimous consent. We really need voting buttons. Come on, can we go with voting buttons?
If there are any objections, please record them in the chat if your audio is not working. So I appreciate that feedback. I know it's sort of a difficult conversation to have, but you know, what has been the shining light in Tampa Bay is folks working together towards collaborative solutions, and I'm happy to hear that we're heading down that path once again to address some of the issues we're now seeing in Old Tampa Bay. So thank you for that, and again, we'll keep the consortium apprised of the data analysis we're pursuing and any new data sources that might come in between now and the next meeting. Last slide before I sort of wrap up, sort of giving an overview of how this fits into the overall timeline for delivery of the 2020 reasonable assurance update. So, you know, taking this conversation in hand, you know, we will probably continue to convene that Old Tampa Bay working group throughout the course of 2021. We will develop this annual water quality and Nmcra assessment update and hopefully try to get this to DEP and EPA no later than June of 2021. I think we're committed as a program and with contractor support to probably get you guys a draft by around the April timeframe for y'all to review before formal submission to DEP and EPA based on the motion that just passed. But in the meantime, we also want to make the ask and push for entities to provide loading information for 2020 to Tony's shop so that we could start assembling that data and continuing to make assessments of conditions in the Bay, particularly in Old Tampa Bay. I think there are some ongoing discussions in the consortium on any needed updates of allocations. I know there's some discussions, particularly with the Piney Point facility, that might necessitate some adjustments into the future for the next reasonable assurance period. And there might be others surrounding some of the land use, land cover discussions we had early in 2020. So again, I think we need to continue those discussions as a consortium body, and those are separate, but also part of the overall 2020 NMCRA update. And then we're always going to continue to ask you all, and I think some of you have over the past couple months of entering new information into the action plan database. I think some of you might have had some issues with entering some of that data, so please continue to reach out to my staff, particularly Maya, who's been handling the action plan database updates. So we know it's a clunky system, but we want to continue to ask for all the partners to enter their load reduction projects or any projects that might have a nutrient management benefit for the Bay into that database, so that we can ultimately assemble that data and put it into this next reasonable assurance update. And then, you know, shooting for sort of having a draft by mid 2020 after we're through next year. for final discussion of the consortium and hopefully finalized by late 2022 for submission to DEP and EPA. So those are sort of the next remaining steps. 2021 will be the 5th year of water quality assessment, and based on the conversations we had, there might be some additional work that's needed to go into that reasonable assurance update, especially if we don't meet the regulatory threshold in Old Tampa Bay again for 2021, because that might put us into those additional assessment steps at that point, barring any future data gaps with the ongoing pandemic, and what might be experienced in 2021. So that's sort of an outline and path forward from my mind. I'll be happy to open it again up to the floor if there's any questions on that.
Yeah, Nan had a question about whether or not Janicki will be pulling the NPDES discharges for point sources, or if they'll provide a reporting template for everyone to submit.
Ray, can you respond?
Yep, I got it. Yeah, Nan, we'll send out, like we have in the past, we'll send out your the data reporting sheets that were provided to us last time, and y'all can just add on to them for 2020. It seems to work pretty well. We know we've got the data from the best source, so that's what we'll do.
And again, we would appreciate you guys responding to that as quickly as possible. That just gives us additional data to make some judgment calls on the observed conditions relative to nutrient loadings over the most recent period. So your cooperation would be appreciated. Any other questions? So I think the only thing just left to say is that we need to continue to investigate Old Tampa Bay a little bit more, and we have all these sort of new questions that we're facing in this bay segment, and trying to get a gauge and understanding of how sort of these external stressors and possible restoration solutions that we're investigating with partners might have a benefit for both water quality conditions as well as overall seagrass. So we're committed to as a estuary program to continue down this path, and we're appreciative of the consortium's cooperation and continued desire to see what we can do in Old Tampa Bay above and beyond nutrient loads. I think I'll stop there, unless there's any further questions or discussion on consortium next steps. Not seeing or hearing any, so I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. So Maya, can you pull the agenda back up?
I think Ray just had an update on some of the additional analyses that we were looking at towards the tail end of last year, trying to make some connections with observed nutrient loading conditions and chlorophyll A. So Ray, are you able to share your screen? Okay.
Yeah, I believe I am. Give me control of the screen, Maya. Are y'all seeing a presentation?
Yep, you've got control. We can see it.
Great. So this is an update. We've been looking at trying to refine relationships between chlorophyll in Old Tampa Bay and loadings to the bay. And of course, we've been working on this for almost as long as y'all have been around the estuary program since the mid-90s when we started all this stuff. So in the past,
if I could just begin by saying that we had some discussions in previous meetings about the higher chlorophylls, and if everyone can recall, and there was some of the work that Marcus had done as well, is that I had identified a critical period of basically July, August, September. And it's those chlorophylls that are driving the mean annual chlorophyll values in Old Tampa Bay, as well as in other segments. But so we're focusing now on looking at those specific 3 months of elevated chlorophylls of July, August, September.
Yeah, and actually it's so those summer months is what's driving our high annual means. So we wanted to look to see if we can find relationships between those monthly high values, that peak summer chlorophyll, and what's going on with loadings at a monthly level. So we put together a data set of our summer chlorophylls and the monthly loadings, leading up to those summers and during those summertime periods, to see if we can draw out some kind of relationships and how strong those relationships might be. And actually, we used a 4-month period of July through October for our summer chlorophylls. That's when our chlorophyll values in the bay are typically up above the targets, and sets up our high annual values. We put together a time series for every year. We have this summer chlorophyll value that we feed into our analyses. We put that together with our monthly loads, and then we started looking at a variety of combinations of time periods to look at loads and compare them, see how they related to that summertime chlorophyll. We looked at 2 consecutive month periods and went back from the beginning of summer back into the preceding November. We also looked at 3 consecutive month periods, 5 consecutive month periods, and then we took a varying number of months to look at the mean loads over the 3-month, 4-month, 5-month, 6-month period, all the way back to November. So we might be looking at a set of loads from July through October through July, and then as far back as November through July, just to see what all different type of if we could find any nice relationships that would explain what's going on in those summer times. So I mentioned with the 2-month and 3-month and 5-month windows, we also, that was relating that peak summer chlorophyll to loads. We also looked at the loading ratio, then the TN to hydrologic load ratio, to see if that might tell us anything as well. And we used the entire 85 through 2019 record, and some of the we also ran some of these evaluations where we removed 2009, and I'll show you why in a minute, and we removed 4 years due to very high, relatively high periodinium blooms, just to see if we got better relationships with or without those years considered. When we looked at that entire 35-year record now, and look at, we got our best relationship when we looked at the mean loads from July and August and compared them to that mean 4-month summertime chlorophyll. And one data point that stuck out ended up being 2009, just kind of outside of the range of everything else, and looked different. The overall relationship was significant, statistically significant, but it only explained about 20% of the variation in chlorophyll. We wanted to see what would happen if we took out the 2009. And this top graphic shows that shows the cell counts, the periodinium cell counts. And I've got outlined in green what happened in 2009. It's a relatively high concentrations were showed. And in that bottom graphic, I've circled with green that 2009 summer peak, which is considerably higher than any others that showed up. We don't know why yet. Exactly, that's different than the other periodinum years. It's something we're looking at as we move along. This is an example of some of the graphics that come out of what we're looking at. The top 2, we actually did a log transform of chlorophyll and the TN loads, and this is the top left one's looking at the November through March mean TN load, and the top right one's looking at the April through August TN load. Like I said, these are just some examples. And the bottom 2 are for those same periods, but they're the non-log transformed. So you can see how we had several groups of statistical relationships and graphics to look at to guide us along what might be the best way to look at loads influencing that summer peak bloom. And these are just some more examples for the comparing to at the top the November through July. So we looked at a 9-month previous loads to find it. At the back end, removed 2009 here. We ended up with a relationship explained about 25% of the variance in the summertime chlorophyll. It was significant, but it's only explained about 25% relationship of that variability. So this is where we've gotten at the moment. We're continuing to evaluate other potential drivers of what's making this these summertime peak chlorophyll events change over time, and in addition to our monthly TN loadings. And of course, the other things we can look at, we've talked before about the nutrient loading model for Tampa Bay, accounting for intersegment exchanges, nutrients between base segments and other internal processes. And Marcus has shown us some pretty interesting stuff recently about what's going on with temperature and salinity changes over time in old Tampa Bay especially. So those are some other things that we're looking at incorporating into this evaluation as we move along. Anybody have any questions? And actually, we'll be providing a report on this, and associated with that will be an entire large group of graphics and statistical analyses files if anyone really wants to get into the weeds and look at how some of this stuff relates.
And I think this will be very helpful as we move forward with the Old Tampa Bay Working Group, kind of continue down these path discussions on how best to manage the system based on these new information.
All right, well, that brings us to open discussion. Anybody have any topics they want to talk about? Otherwise, we'll look at when we can schedule our next meeting. Hearing none, I think Maya had looked at either the 26th or April 9th. It's a little farther down on the agenda.
Is there any strong opposition to holding it on March 26th? I think that's a Friday, right?
I guess my only question would be, is that during spring break or not? Not that any of us will be able to go anywhere.
That's a good
But
question.
it is put in that time frame. I'm not sure if it is or not. So.
It's not for Pinellas. I'm not sure when Manatee and Pasco and Hillsborough spring breaks are.
Well, they never let
Hillsborough
Pinellas
is the week
Hillsborough
before.
be the same week, so more than likely it is us. So
Friday the
Hillsborough is the week
26th,
before.
Friday the 26th is the FWEA Utility Council regular meeting that morning.
Parents' weekend.
So sounds like the 26th might have some problem. I cannot attend if the utility council meeting is that weekend. I am a board member, so I would not be available. I'm glad somebody knew that was happening. Thank you, whoever that was.
How about April 2nd? Is there a reason why you didn't have April 2nd on the? Should be the following Friday.
That's Good Friday.
Oh, that's Good Friday. Yep. About March 25th, which is a Thursday before the utilities conference.
My only comment, Ed, is that the TAC is on the 24th.
And Maya, y'all's spring break is the week of the 15th or the 14th?
The 19th, I think.
Yeah, the 19th. That's that Friday.
I hesitate to say it, but April 1st might be a better option. April Fools.
I'm all in, man. The way it's been going, why not April 1st?
Does that pose any conflicts for anybody? That's a Thursday, April 1st. Hearing none, I think we'll plan for that morning of April 1st, probably 9:30 to a 12 o'clock meeting. We'll send out updates.
Well, if there's nothing else, it's great to see / sort of hear everybody. And Happy New Year. And I guess we'll adjourn the meeting.
Well, Jeff, I want to commend you again, Jeff, on your Neil Young look. It's looking better and better.
Thanks, Tony. Yep. I can't wait till I
Thank
go
you,
back.
everybody.
I'm almost to 12 saved haircuts at this point. I'm bankrupting my barber, I'm sure.
My wife did my pandemic haircut. I don't want to show it. It's in the other direction.
I've heard that the Flowbee works great, Tony, so.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. You know, the darn thing is like $150 now after George Clooney, put the plug in for it.
They sold out, right? Do they have supply?
I think they may have. That's true.
Ray, I don't know if you saw in the chat, but Carrie put a comment in there just saying that in some years there's elevated chlorophyll that's post-pyro bloom due to other taxa at elevated abundances. Something to consider when you're looking at October and September values.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Carrie.
Hey, real quickly, confirming that we're going to get a link to populate the MPDS loadings for 2020.
Yeah.
I'll send you a file.
Okay, awesome.
The
Thanks.
file that I received from y'all last time around.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
All right, everybody, be safe.